Okay, are we ready? What? Yeah, okay, we're ready. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final class in this series, the development of Torah. We certainly haven't exhausted, and we will not exhaust the subject by any stretch of the imagination after today's class. So this is just to whet your appetite to learn more about Torah. Today I want to talk about the uniqueness of Jewish law. There are many legal systems in the world. Every country has its own legal system. Even the corrupt, murderous communists and Nazis had laws that they felt you had to follow. See, even when I know of my own relatives in Russia, even when they were prosecuted for counter-revolutionary activity because they were spreading Jewish education, and they were arrested and put to death, actually. My wife's uncle was given a death sentence because he taught Torah publicly. But that had to be done legally. You had to sign a confession. The fact that you had no choice whether you should sign or not is a separate issue, but they had laws. You have to follow the law. So every society has its own legal system. Some are very corrupt, and some are very enlightened. But Jewish law stands in a class of its own. It is entirely different, even when it says the same thing as secular laws will say. And what is the salient difference between Jewish law and its secular counterpart? The fundamental difference is that Jewish law is rooted in the Torah, and the Torah is divine. Secular law was created by people, and people, by definition, are limited, they're finite, they are fallible, they can make mistakes, and therefore every system of law is inherently deficient. The Torah, which is divine knowledge, is therefore impeccable, infallible. And as I explained in an earlier class, even when the rabbis make a mistake, and rabbis are human beings, they can make mistakes, but if they base their decisions on their understanding of Jewish law, and they do it in accordance with the principles that were handed down at Mount Sinai, that too is God's will until such time that they realize they made the mistake, and then they have to atone for it. There's a volume of the Talmud which is devoted to the court, the rabbis of the court, who err, who gave out an erroneous ruling. So even though Jews had to follow it because this was the system that God put up, once they recognize that they were wrong, they have to retract and they have to bring an atonement in many cases. So that's the salient, the most fundamental difference between Jewish law and secular law. Now there are resemblances between Jewish law and its secular counterpart, but those resemblances are either influenced by Jewish law. Yes, it's true that secular law was influenced by Jewish law. The Bible, as they call it, has influenced American jurisprudence to some extent. So it's not as if Jewish law and secular law say the same thing because they both came up with the same ideas. They were influenced by Jewish law in some cases, in limited cases, but whatever resemblances there are otherwise is artificial. It's not, and I'll give you a few examples. One of the commandments in the Torah is that in the land of Israel, every 7 years, the land has to remain fallow. What does that mean? You're not allowed to work on the land. So people will say, that's good agricultural practice. That's the way we do it in America also. That's how we do it wherever people grow crops. You leave a field or several fields fallow. It means you don't work on it so that you don't deplete all the nutrients in the earth. So you see, the Torah and secular society agree on something. Yes, they agree on something, but for totally different reasons. The fact that the Torah tells you to rest on the seventh year has nothing to do with the nutrients in the earth. Because even in those areas where things have to remain fallow, it's not everything. Let's say you have 10 farms, 10 plots of land. You leave 1 or 2 of the plots of land without cultivating them for a year or so, and the rest you do plant, otherwise you won't have any food. The next year you rotate. It's a rotational system. But in Jewish law, in the land of Israel, every farm had to shut down. No agricultural work whatsoever in the entire land of Israel. This is the biblical commandment. It's mentioned near the end of the book of Leviticus. So is it the same thing? No, it's totally different. But the rationale behind these practices are very different. In the rest of society, the reason why we leave the land, we don't plant on that particular plot of land, is to restore the nutrients. It's good farming technique. But in the Torah, it has a totally different reason. It's to tell you that God is in control and it's his land. And 6 years of a cycle, he lets you work on that land. And the 7th year, he says, no, it's not yours anymore. It's mine, and therefore it's free for all. Anyone could take whatever had grown in the 7th year. Anyone could take that fruit or that produce. It's not yours anymore. Because when we get successful in owning things, it gets to our head, and we think that we're God. When it comes to our property, what's the worst thing that a person can do in America? Trespass on someone else's property. Maybe it's not the worst thing. It's one of the bad things. People don't care about what you know about their private life, but don't ever trespass on their turf, or else they're going to take out their shotgun and shoot you, which is what happens sometimes in America. Because your property is sacrosanct, and God says, no, it's not yours. 6 years, I'm giving you the right to work on the land and to take whatever the land produces, provided you give some of it to the Kohen, some of it to the Levi, some of it to the poor, some of it you take to Jerusalem and eat and partake of it there in Jerusalem. And then on the 7th year, 0, you do nothing with the land. It's God's land, not yours. Also, a second reason why we have that sabbatical year is because when people are involved in planting, cultivating the land, planting, plowing, watering, all the things that we do for things to grow, you don't have time for the study of Torah. How much can you study? In an agricultural society, you wake up at dawn or before dawn, and you're working until dusk or later. And when you come home, you have no strength to do anything. So people cannot really devote themselves to Torah study in the 6 years in which they work on the land. The 7th year, when they don't have any work, they could devote to Torah study. That has nothing to do with the secular emphasis on leaving some of the land fallow, unworked on. Same result, you could say, but totally different system behind it. That's one example. Another example is the Torah has a lot about ritual bathing, going to the mikveh, immersing in a mikveh. And it's good hygienic practice. I think I mentioned it in an earlier class, that during the bubonic plague, when Jews were accused of poisoning the wells, and some historians say that the reason why Jews were accused of it, anti-Semites don't need reasons to accuse Jews of anything, but sometimes they do find excuses. What was their excuse? Why are Jews not suffering as much as everyone else? The fatalities among Jews, supposedly, I don't even know if it's true, but this is what they said, was much lower for the Jewish people. And why was it lower? Because Jews are constantly involved in washing their bodies and their hands. Before we eat bread, we wash our hands. When so many different examples of people immersing in a mikveh. Many Hasidic Jews go to the mikveh every single day. But before you go to the mikveh, you have to shower. You have to be clean before you cleanse yourself. So people think that going to the mikveh or washing your hands is a hygienic practice. No, it isn't. It's not intended for hygiene. Hygiene precedes the washing of your hands and the immersion in a mikveh. The immersion in a mikveh is a way of purifying ourselves spiritually. So superficially, it seems that they're similar. That we're just a little bit ahead of the rest of society, and we invented hygienic practices way before the rest of society adopted them. No, it's not. We're not claiming originality, because it's totally a different concept. That's another example. A third example of kashrut, kosher laws, the dietary laws. So many people would say, we don't have to keep kosher anymore, because the reason why they kept kosher in the past was because kosher was a more healthful lifestyle. We avoided eating pork because pork could have trichinosis. I think I mentioned this in an earlier class. No, it's not for that reason. We don't keep kosher because it's healthier. It may very well be healthier, because we don't eat the meat that has blood in it. We purge the blood, and that's where some bacteria, I guess, could sometimes find itself. So it may be healthier. We don't certain animals that are not well, that the FDA would approve. Jewish law says, no, you can't use those animals for meat. So, yes, in balance, kosher is healthier than non-kosher. But that's not the reason we keep kosher. That's a fringe benefit. We keep kosher as a way of introducing holiness in the very mundane activity of eating. There's nothing more mundane, nothing more common that for human beings than eating, and we make that holy. We make the world in which we live a holier world. We elevate the world. Another example of an eye for an eye. Now, there are some historians who love to find proof that Jewish law is not original. The Jews are so unimaginative. We can't think of anything on our own. I remember a student of mine, an Israeli student at UB, came to my class crying. He was literally crying. He had tears in his eyes. And I asked him, what's wrong? He says he just came from a Judaic studies class. And the professor, very secular person, told him, Judaism has invented nothing. Jews have just taken everything from every other nation. We lived amongst the Persians, so we borrowed Persian ideas. We lived amongst the Egyptians, so we borrowed Egyptian ideas. And there's nothing original about Judaism. We just steal from everyone. That's essentially what this Judaic professor was teaching. And he was devastated by that. I mean, Judaism has nothing to offer, which of course is the most ridiculous thing in the world. I comfort him, telling him that this professor knows nothing about Judaism and probably nothing about history as well. These people who purport to be academics, I'm very suspicious about their credentials when they say things like that. At any rate, there is a code of law that predated Sinai, Code of Hammurabi, and there are historians who say that a lot of Jewish law is similar to Hammurabi's code of law. There's a theory, and I can't vouch for it, that Hammurabi was actually Nimrod, the king at the time of Abraham, and he might have been influenced by Abraham. I don't think there's any truth to that, but at any rate, they give an example. You see in the Torah it says an eye for an eye, and Hammurabi says something similar to that. But if you look at Hammurabi's code, you see he has a very evil code. For example, if you injure someone's child, then the punishment is that your child has to be killed. That's Hammurabi. When the Torah says an eye for an eye, it has never been understood to mean literally you poke out someone's eye for taking out someone else's eye. It was always meant to be a financial penalty. You can't really give a price to an eye. You can't. Which person would, if I would approach any person, any sane person, and say, I want to poke out your eye, how much money do I have to give you for that? If I give you $1,000, will you let me do it? No. What about $1 million? $1 billion? Well, let me think. That people will not be willing to give up their eye for any amount of money. So you're not really paying for the eye. You're paying for the financial loss. Because let's say you're a surgeon, and because you lost an eye, you cannot do surgery anymore, and now you have to get a job that'll pay a lot less. So if, let's say, you're expected to live another 20 years of working as a surgeon, and that will bring in $5 million, and now you could only make $1 million in that course, that means you had a loss of $4 million. That's the way insurance companies would measure, losses. So that's what the Torah meant, not to actually poke out someone's eye or tooth or whatever it may be. But we weren't influenced by Hammurabi's code, even if there's some very superficial resemblances. I think that another example in civil law, criminal law, is the Fifth Amendment. There's a book written by, I forgot who the author is, and I forgot what he says there, so why are we talking about it? No, I forgot the author's name, but he has a preface to the book is the law of self-incrimination in Jewish law, self-incrimination in Jewish law, and has a preface written by Arthur Goldberg. Does anyone remember Arthur Goldberg? He was a justice in the Supreme Court before, I think, JFK made him the ambassador to the UN to get him off the court. But anyhow, Arthur Goldberg wrote a preface, and he said, self-incrimination, we have the Fifth Amendment, where you can't be forced to incriminate yourself, was influenced by Jewish law, which also says that you cannot incriminate yourself. And there's actually no resemblance. These two laws have absolutely nothing in common. I say nothing in common, I mean nothing conceptually in common. Because in American law, what's the principle behind self-incrimination? They can't force you to incriminate yourself. They can't force you to testify, to confess to a crime. Why not? Why not? Why not tell you have to go on the witness stand and we have to interrogate you? Because in the olden days, they used to torture people to get a confession out of them. So now we're a little bit more enlightened, so we don't actually torture people, but we try to force them legally by putting them on the witness stand. So there's a very great danger. Who knows how much pressure can be put on people? So the American Fifth Amendment is an enlightened way of saying, no, that you cannot force people to confess. You can't use torture. In the Soviet Union, they used torture to get confessions. They would literally torture you until you would sign the confession. I never understood, if they're going to torture you to sign the confession, why couldn't they just sign it for you? They had to couch it in some legal terms, as I said before. That's something I never fully understood, why evil people have to find ways of legitimizing their evil, and they can't just go ahead and do it and say what we did was right. But anyhow, that's another subject for psychology. So the Fifth Amendment prevents you from forced confession. Jewish law has nothing of that sort. You cannot confess in Jewish law to a crime. If someone comes to the court and says, I murdered so-and-so, or I robbed the bank, you will not be prosecuted. They will just expunge that from your testimony. Moreover, if you came to court and you said, John, and myself, both of us committed murder, the court will accept your testimony against John, but not against yourself. There is no way you can incriminate yourself. The whole principle of self-incrimination does not exist in Jewish law. What's the rationale behind that? So there are two reasons given. We don't always know the reasons, but in this case, Maimonides gives a reason, and others give other reasons. Maimonides' reason is psychological, that there are people who would like to harm themselves, but they don't want to do it themselves. So what do? We even have this today, where people will commit some crime hoping that the police will come and kill them. What is it called? Suicide by police, I think.
Suicide by cop.
Suicide by cop, okay, that's the technical term for it. People want to take their own life, they want to subject themselves to pain and suffering, even death, but they're cowards, or for whatever reason they won't do it to themselves. They want to go out maybe in glory, that everyone should know about it, whatever the reason is, and they will commit a crime in a way that they know they're going to get shot by the police. Well, Maimonides says a similar thing, that some people want to hurt themselves, but they don't want to do it personally. So what do? They confess to a crime for which there's a penalty, with corporal punishment, death penalty, whatever it may be. Therefore, we don't believe anyone who confesses to a crime. If there are witnesses that testify to it, then a person will be prosecuted. and convicted, but the confession has no value whatsoever. That's one reason. Another reason given by another great authority, commentator on Maimonides, is that when a person confesses, they're subjecting their body to punishment. You don't own your own body. I know there's a big war raging in society today about abortion, and you often hear people saying, it's my body. And I'm not going to go into whether Jewish law does allow abortion in some cases, and it's a little bit more complicated than just saying no abortion ever or abortion always. But that's not what I want to talk about. I just want to talk about the idea that it's my body and I can do with my body as I please. No, that does not exist in Jewish law. Your body is given to you on loan, and you're not allowed to deliberately harm your body. So to say that it's my body, I can do with it whatever I want, that's fundamentally a flawed argument. But anyhow, getting back to confession, when you're confessing about someone else. It's not your body. You can't confess about something that doesn't belong to you. At any rate, whatever the reason is, self-incrimination has nothing, in Jewish law, has nothing to do with self-incrimination in secular law, even though they seem to resemble, and it's sometimes enticing for people who want to show how advanced Jews are, as Arthur Goldberg did in that preface, that we, the American system, got it from Jewish law. Now, I can't say it was not influenced in some indirect way, but it's certainly not the same thing. Halacha, Jewish law, has its own internal logic. It's not that it doesn't have to borrow from other systems and from other cultures. There's a story of Unclus. Yes.
We're talking about penalties that apply to the body. Okay.
Right.
So theft and things like that.
Oh, okay. Good question. I should have anticipated that. Confession to a crime doesn't exist in Jewish law. But if I say, I robbed a bank of $10,000, that means I'm admitting that I owe $10,000. So they stripped the confession, they just expunged the criminal aspect of it, but the civil aspect, yes, you are believed. Because you can give someone $10,000. No one, it's not something that you don't have the power to do. So in financial matters, if you confess that you owe someone money, if I tell you, I owe you $100, and there are witnesses to that statement, I have to pay you $100, even if it's not true. Even if you say, no, you don't owe me $100, but since I said I owe you $100, that means I am giving you $100. I have committed myself to give you $100. So you're right, if it's anything that has a financial side to it, you can confess to it and it's accepted. But if the criminal aspect of it, you can't do. You can't incriminate yourself in Jewish law. In any way, no. If you want to be incriminated, get witnesses that can testify that you committed the crime.
But if you're speeding in a car or something like that, you can't say, yeah, I was speeding, or what? To that extent? I mean,
you're talking about speeding is not one of the commandments in the Torah. Thou shalt not speed.
I just use that as a fit.
Yes, but imagine if that would be a crime, a criminal offense, then Jewish law would say you can't go to the police and say, you know what, I was going 90 on a 40-mile-per-hour road.
Driving while intoxicated.
The same thing. But if they catch you doing it, that's different, yes.
What about something like a husband confessing to his wife about adultery?
Yeah.
So can he confess to, it has no financial aspect, it has no criminal.
Okay, if a spouse confesses to adultery, it's not something that has to do with a court system, with a legal system. It's because the husband believed the wife when she said she committed adultery. And there's some technical aspects of it that sometimes that you do and sometimes you don't. But that's a matter of whether you believe it or not. It's not a matter of incriminating someone. There's no incrimination. It may break the marriage, but it's not a crime. The confession does not constitute a crime. Unclus was a nephew, yes?
If three people conspire to kill somebody, do two of them count as witnesses for the other one?
Co-conspirator.
Yes, they could be, because I mentioned before, you can testify against your buddy, and even though you're saying we did it, the part about yourself doesn't work. But once you incriminate your buddy, he can't incriminate you. He's a criminal. If there are two witnesses, you have to have two witnesses in Jewish law.
That's why I said three.
Yeah, okay, so if two witnesses come and they say, we committed a crime together with Joe, then Joe is the criminal now. He's accused, and we have evidence he's a criminal. Once you're a criminal, you lose your reliability, so you can't go back and testify against the others. You need two witnesses, other witnesses, to testify against them. Unclus was a nephew of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, and he was enamored with Judaism, and he converted to Judaism to the extent that he wrote a commentary on the Torah, actually a translation into Aramaic. To this day, every week we review the Torah portion twice, the weekly portion from the text of the Torah, and one time the translation of Unclus. He's the most important commentary of the Torah, before Rashi. And hundreds of thousands of Jews do that every week. And this Unclus, when his uncle found out that he converted to Judaism, he wanted him back. And there's a whole story about how he sent soldiers to him, and Unclus started to talk to them. They also converted to Judaism. And then the next time he sent soldiers, and he says, don't engage him in any discussions. So they didn't say a thing, and Unclus on the way out touched the mezuzah. So they started saying, what's that? And he explained to them, they converted to Judaism. So Hadrian gave up on trying to get his recalcitrant nephew back into the fold. And he was talking to Hadrian, and he explained to him that you'll never understand Judaism because you're not circumcised. Being circumcised has an effect on your ability to grasp Jewish logic. We're talking about Jewish logic. A guy comes to a rabbi, a Gentile comes to a rabbi, and he says, teach me Talmud. And the rabbi says, nah, it's not for you, because our logic is very different. So he says, test me. So, okay, the rabbi says, two people come down a chimney. One of them has a face covered with soot, all black, and the other one's face is clean. Who's going to wash his face? And the guy says, Rabbi, it's obvious. The guy with the black face is going to wash off the soot. And the rabbi says, you see, I can't teach you Talmud. The black guy, the one who has the black face, is looking at his fellow and he sees he's clean, so he's not going to wash his face because he thinks he's clean. While the guy with a clean face looks at the guy with the black face, says, oh, my face must be dirty, so he washes his face. So he says, oh, now I understand the Talmudic logic. Test me again. Ask me another question. He says, two people come down a chimney. One has a black face. One has a clean face. Who's going to wash his face? So he says, obviously, the one who has the clean face will wash his face because he sees the other guy. So the rabbi says, what happens if there's a mirror there? And there's a mirror. The guy with the black face knows that his face is dirty, and the other guy knows that his face is clean. Oh, you didn't tell me about a mirror, but you have to use your head. He says, okay, test me again. So he asks him the same question, and the guy says, well, if there's no mirror, then, of course, the guy with the clean face will wash his face. If there's a mirror, the guy with the black face will wash it. And the rabbi says, you see, I can't teach you Talmud. How is it possible that two people come down from the same chimney, and one is covered with soot, and the other one is clean? So you're not ready to study Talmud. There's a certain internal system of logic when you study Jewish law, and uncles tried to tell him you have to be part of the Jewish people to understand it, to appreciate it. There's an expression of the Talmud, Chachma bagoyim tamin, Torah bagoyim al tamin, which means if someone tells you that a non-Jew is brilliant, has a tremendous amount of wisdom, believe him. Jews don't monopolize wisdom. They're brilliant people. And there can be people who are not Jewish who are smarter than Jewish people. I know a lot of them. People say Einstein was the smartest person in the world. Not necessarily. I don't have to claim that Einstein was the smartest person in the world. He was Jewish, right, but the fact that he was Jewish doesn't mean I have to believe that Jews are smarter than everyone else. There's no law that says that Jews have to be smarter. In fact, I could argue the other way around, that some Jews are very lacking in smartness. But if someone tells you that a Gentile masters Torah, don't believe that. Because Torah is a spiritual text that was given to the Jewish people, and only they are really able to fathom its secrets and understand its internal logic. And therefore, and that's based on what we were saying until now, the Torah is not the same as any other discipline. It has some superficial similarities, or we influenced other systems ultimately, but that's not to say that the Torah could be fit into this, slotted into the same category, the same rubric of other systems of law. And here it translates in an interesting halacha. If two Jews get into an argument, believe it or not, Jews sometimes disagree. Once it happens every 70 years. So when two Jews, let's say partners in a business, and they get into a feud, they're required to go to a Jewish court, to a bet din. If the Jewish court, if one side refuses to go, then the court will give them permission to go to a secular court, just to undo the injustice, to save someone's money if it's a matter of finances. But initially you have to go to a Jewish court. If one party refuses to abide by the decision of the Jewish court, then again you can go to a secular court to get justice. But initially you have to take the other side to a Jewish court, because you could say, well, what's wrong with the secular court? They do a good job. They're fair. They're honest. They have integrity, assuming that we know that to be a fact. But no, Jewish people have to go by Jewish law, because Jewish law, even when it agrees with secular law in some cases, Jewish law does have its own internal spiritual logic. It's divine, and therefore it's the right system to follow. The fact that secular law could sometimes legislate laws that make sense, Jewish law says you're obligated to follow. American law has certain laws on the books. The Talmud says that we're obligated to follow the law of the land. So it doesn't mean that we don't respect the law of the land. We do. But when there's a conflict between Jewish law and secular law, unless it's in the area of commerce, which is based on people's goodwill to one another, we have to follow Jewish law. Let me just cite this one example. There's a fallacious argument. If two people want to get divorced, Torah requires a get. The husband gives the wife a document called a get, and it has many laws that apply to how it's written. And I heard over the years of some secularized religious Jews who belong to some religious denomination who say, well, now that we have secular law that has divorces, we follow the secular law. No, there's no such thing. Jewish law says you can follow the secular law and get a divorce, a civil divorce, but you still have to have the get. Yes?
So if you go to the Beit Din first, you said you could then go to the secular court? And I didn't understand.
No, if you go to the Bet Din and one party refuses to abide by their decision, since they don't have a police force to enforce it,
Right.
you're allowed to go to a secular court.
Okay, and will the secular court then rely in any way?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. Will the secular court respect and accept the ruling of the religious court? In some cases, yes. Why? Because before you go to a rabbinical court, they make you sign that you're going to abide by their decision. It's like mediation.
It's a contract.
It's by binding arbitration. And it's a contract. So even if the rabbis are off the wall and they give a crazy ruling, But since both parties agreed to it initially, that is binding in American law. But that's not because they respect Jewish law necessarily, it's because you agree to it. Now, I want to list the differences between Jewish law and secular law. I have about 8 differences. Number 1, as we mentioned before, Jewish law is divine. Secular law is man-made. Number 2, based on number 1, Jewish law shapes and molds society. Jewish law was given to change society, to elevate, refine, edify society. Secular law is shaped and molded by society. But that's why laws have to change. American laws or any other country has to change with the passage of time because we have other needs. The laws that govern the horse and buggy are no longer adequate to deal with cars.
Not when the current Supreme Court.
Jewish law is revealed. Secular law may be based on a natural law theory that believes that laws are natural and can be discovered by people without the need for a divine revelation. Okay, this needs a little bit of explanation. There's a famous debate amongst philosophers, theologians, as to whether law is natural, it's built into the world, into nature, or law has to be revealed from an outside source. And many, Catholicism, for example, believes in natural law. If you ever hear them arguing why they're against certain practices, they say because it's not natural. Judaism does not accept that as the basis for Jewish law. We believe that law was revealed to us by God at Mount Sinai. That on our own, left to our own devices, we will not necessarily be able to determine what's right and what's wrong. Now, there is a statement in the Talmud that if the Torah had not been given, we would be forced to learn. Sorry about that, I covered up the screen. We would be forced to learn morality from animals if the Torah had not been given. But it's not a very effective system of education to learn from animals, because it depends which animals you want to learn from. Would you want to learn from a tiger, a hungry tiger, to devour anyone who gets in your way? I don't think that would be the best system of education. So Judaism says you can't rely on natural law, that you can just discover what's right and what's wrong just by looking into nature, looking into yourself. It doesn't mean it doesn't support some teachings, but you ultimately need law to come from outside. Secular systems of law do believe in natural law. I'm not saying all of them, but some of them do believe in natural law, that law is something that has to be discovered from within nature, within society. Number 5, Jewish law is obligation-oriented. Secular law is rights-oriented. That's what all we hear day in and day out. A mother's right to an abortion, the fetus' right to live. Both sides are wrong from the point of view of Judaism. We don't care about whose rights are being preserved or undermined. We talk about obligations. What are our obligations to the mother? What are our obligations to the child? Sometimes my obligation requires me to do something that denies my right. I don't have a right. I have a right to drive 55 on a highway that says 55. I have a right. But if someone is in front of me and is blocking my way, I don't have a right to shoot him. Why? Because I have an obligation to respect the other person's safety. It's all about obligation, not about rights. Yes, because I have an obligation to respect your privacy, you have a right to get me to abide by that. So where does everything begin? Everything begins with obligations, and obligations spawn rights. In the secular world, everything is about rights, and that creates obligations. Everything's about rights, and this is a long lecture, but I think I have to mention one part. Whenever you have two entities that are fighting for their rights, who will prevail in the end? In most cases, the one who is stronger. You know, there's an expression, might makes right. That's a very true expression, because if you are more powerful, you will be able to impose your ideas on anyone else who's less powerful. If you talk about obligations, it doesn't work. It won't happen that way. Just because I'm stronger than you doesn't make me feel I have a right to do something, because I have obligations. And my whole mind, if I'm following Jewish law, is oriented towards what are my obligations. When we wake up in the morning, what is the first thing that enters my mind, or what any person who's thinking about his day, and leaving aside the religious aspect of it, is what are my responsibilities today? That's how Judaism would look at it. The secular world would say, what am I going to do to preserve my rights, to further my rights, to advance my rights, to advance my benefits? You know, when you hear advertisements on radio, I'm sure on television as well, they tell you deserve it. You get what you deserve. Everyone is focused on, I deserve this, I have this right, instead of saying, this is your obligation. That's not popular to talk about obligations. Number 6, Jewish law is comprehensive. Secular law is compartmentalized, or it's limited to certain areas of life. Jewish law is not just about financial things. It's not just about criminal things. It's not just about speed limits. Jewish law is about every aspect of our lives. Everything that we do, our eating, our sleeping, our dressing, our everything, our family life, our relationships with others, everything is governed by Jewish law, telling us how to make that activity more spiritual, more godly. Secular law doesn't deal with those things. Secular law does not care what kind of food you eat, because it's not there to make you holier. It's not there to make you a better person. It's there to protect society from ill, which is a good thing. You see, in all what I'm saying here, I'm not trying to knock secular law. I'm just trying to say that it's not the same thing as Jewish law. It has its it has its purpose. It has its objectives. And if we wouldn't have secular law, we'd be living in a jungle. People would just do whatever they want. Jewish law does not have enforcement capabilities. Another thing, this deals specifically with a court case. What is the objective of the lawyers in a secular law situation? The prosecutor is there to convict the accused, to prove that the accused is guilty. The defense lawyer is there to disprove or to take away any proof. No one is looking for the truth. That's not the objective. And they don't hide this. This is an adversarial system, because in America everything is advocacy. You know, if you are an animal rights person, what's your life devoted to? Advocating for animals. And you don't care about other issues as much, because you're the advocate. So let's say you find a flaw in your advocacy, you're going to try to cover it up. That's if you're human, because that's what humans do. If you're obsessed about a certain cause, you're going to push that cause no matter what. That's when you have an advocacy. So the prosecutor wants prosecution. Now, of course, there are unethical prosecutors who will seek prosecution even when they know the person is definitely innocent, and they withhold evidence, exculpatory evidence. That's a crime even in a secular system. But we do know that the prosecutor has an agenda, and the defense lawyer has an agenda, and between the two of them fighting, the innocent hopefully will be proven innocent, and the guilty will hopefully be proven guilty. But it doesn't work that way always. We know so many cases, I've been involved in a few cases, where the prosecutor won and the defense lost because the defense did not do his homework. as well as the prosecutor did, and the innocent person was subjected to a life imprisonment. I've been involved with several cases like that, where the person was 100% definitely innocent, but was railroaded because the prosecutor and the judges and the politicians had it in for this person. If I had more time, I would tell you some of the stories, horror stories. So Jewish law is looking for the truth. The judges in a Jewish court case is not interested in hearing two sides and seeing which side has a better case. He is interested in discovering the truth. Now, it's not easy to discover the truth, and it's much easier just to have a court case where you have two sides fighting it out, and the better presenter would win. And finally, Jewish law does not like lawyers. In Jewish legal cases, in Israel, they do allow, the rabbinical courts do allow, they don't call it a lawyer, they call it to'en rabbani, a rabbinic arguer. Someone to help the litigant who can't formulate his own case as well. So he's allowed to come in there, not to replace the litigant, but to help the litigant. And it's controversial. Many rabbis are against it. In America, we also have that, where one side could bring in a rabbinic arguer, that's the best way of translating it, someone who helps you with your arguments, and the other side then has to bring one in as well, if he wants. But a real lawyer who takes over the case, that is not held in it's not considered to be a very good idea, because, again, the whole purpose of the court case is to discover the truth. Lawyers are trained to obfuscate. Now, I'm not afraid to say this in the presence of lawyers, because I said this, I once had once a conference of judges, law professors, and lawyers. Had the top judge of the Court of Appeals there at UB, and I said this, that the job of the lawyer is to obfuscate, and they all laughed. They weren't offended. If that's your job is to cover up, if you're the defense lawyer, to try to minimize the accusation. We don't have a jury in Jewish court. That doesn't exist at all. While lawyers, some compromise is made that you can allow lawyers to a certain extent, there's no such thing as jury. Because a jury is so, I think, incapable of really reaching a true verdict in a great percentage of the cases. I'm not going to say this is the majority, but I can tell you horror stories about juries who are completely blind to what really went on in the court case. And I'm reminded of the O.J. Simpson case, where you had lawyers talking about the technicalities of what was about DNA. No, I'm not talking about that part. The DNA. I didn't understand a single word of the testimony of those experts. And I can assure you that no one in the jury understood a word that was being said. And the jury was supposed to determine innocence or guilt based on technical information they have no knowledge of. So if the guy who gave the argument one way was a little bit more handsome than the other guy, says, I like that guy, he's a good-looking guy, or some other irrelevant feature. Juries, there was once a court case that my father was involved in about a kosher company in California. I'm sure you heard of Empire Chickens. Mm-hmm. Empire is I think it's the largest, what was then the largest kosher chicken company. And they advertised in California that they're the only kosher chicken company in California. And there was another chicken company, that claimed to be kosher and was under rabbinic supervision. And they took them to court to sue them for millions of dollars. And then Empire countersued them. So both sides were very nervous. And the jury deliberated for about a week. And then both sides were so nervous they settled. They were afraid of, and the jury then was asked, what were you planning on? Which direction were you going? Oh, we were planning on going against Empire. And in the case, Empire was definitely right. My father told me that they took the rabbi of the other company And the lawyer says to him, Rabbi, you claim that the way they process the chickens is kosher? He says, yes, absolutely. What is it based on? It's based on the code of Jewish law. He says, can you tell me where, chapter and verse? He says, I don't remember it by heart. He says, well, I'll give you the volume. And the lawyer who did his homework, who was not Jewish, brings the volume of the Code of Jewish Law that deals with all the laws of kosher, and he says, okay, could you find it for me? And the man says, well, it takes time to find it. He says, we have time. And he's turning pages back and forth, and he says, I can't find it right now, it'll take me as much longer. He says, well, take as long as you need. We can be here all day. And he has to admit that he can't find it, because it doesn't exist. It was a lie. And then when my father got up on the stand and other rabbis, they opened up the volume and they pointed to where it was not kosher, without any hesitation. And it was clear, and the rabbi, another thing, the lawyer asked the rabbi, isn't it true that the rabbi who ordained you withdrew his ordination from you? And he admitted that it was true. So they got a charlatan to claim that the chicken was kosher. So wouldn't you think that Empire would win the case? No. Why? What was the jury's argument? Who gives an East Coast company the right to tell us in California what's right and what's wrong? Had nothing to do with the case. They didn't listen to a single thing in the case. And you want to rely on juries in medical matters? You have two sides. One brings a psychiatrist that says this, and one brings a psychiatrist that says the opposite. Are jurors qualified to determine which psychiatrist is right? Whenever you deal with technical things. So Judaism has no jury, and as we said before, no confession. Secular law thrives on all these three. It thrives on lawyers, juries, and confessions. So that's an example. Okay, we'll have to stop over here. Any questions?
What's the next question here?
We didn't decide yet, but it's going to probably be something more psychological. The Kabbalah of psychology. Something like that. It hasn't been decided yet. But the second class, which we're going to start soon, Blessings, we will still have for another 2 weeks. We'll still continue the series at 11 o'clock. So there won't be a class next week, 10 o'clock. We'll start the new series in a few weeks. But 11 o'clock we'll still have the class. We'll continue with the Blessings. No 10 o'clock next week, yeah. Just 11.
When you start the new program, it's interesting with the psychological aspect, but could you spend a few sessions basically explaining what Kabbalah is, how it...
Okay, we can do that. I don't know, a few sessions, but
Well, I mean, whatever.
it'll be an introductory.
An introduction.
Yeah, right.
So how's the practice going?
Quite good, quite well.
Well, no news?
Is there a prayer to make my fingers move faster? I need a prayer
That's it?
for it.
Yeah.
L23, and
Don't apologize, I'm going to tell you. You're absolutely right if that's your totally right.
It still says 4 minutes, so I just
Basically, Many attorneys turn to arbitration, dealing with panels.